Good evening, members of the Brooklyn Ethical and our guests. I'm happy that you could join us tonight. Welcome to a Lucy's Children presentation. Tonight, we are pleased to have a presentation on the book, The Linden Still Bloom, written as a result of a family collaboration between son and mother. Mr. Dror Kahn is our guest presenter tonight. After his presentation, we will entertain questions from our audience. Our intended focus is America Now. I know that you were wondering about this name, Lucy's Children, so let me take a moment to tell you about our name and about us. Lucy was a discovery of Dr. Jonel Johansen, an anthropologist of note while he was on a dig. On the late morning of November 24, 1974, along with a team member, Tom Gray, Johansen is credited with calling it. Traveling on an alternative route back to camp, he casually looked over his shoulder and saw something interesting. What was ultimately uncovered was to be the historical find of the decade, if not the century. The dig in Hadar, Ethiopia, uncovered the oldest and most complete skeletal remains discovered at the time. The female fossil had literally fallen out of the tree into place of discovery between 3.18 to 3.28 million years ago, depending on who you read. The find was a colossal step in tracing human evolution. It broke, and I quote, a 3 million year gap. Before Lucy, the number of human fossils older than 3 million years old could fit in the palm of your hand. Finding this 3.5-foot tall female that walked upright was both breathtaking and earth-shattering. The fossil was named Lucy, and a tacit nod to the Beatles song Lucy in the Sky, which was popular at the time and blaring from a record player at the home site. The not quite human, but also not quite ape Lucy was deemed an Australopithecus, a pre-human ancestor, a humanoid, an ancestor. At Lucy's Children, we respect our common ancestry and each other. That is our work. As a society, we are progressive, and yes, we have our challenges, but we persevere. At Lucy's Children, we delve into the threads of history, particularly those which shed light into the dark corners of our existence, the missing pages of people and events and our ancestry in the near and distant past. Our primary focus is on Black people, but not exclusively so. Our sessions are dictated by the interests of the participants who research their own inquiries singly and collaboratively and present them in sessions just like this one tonight. Before we morphed into Lucy's Children, we had another self-education formation which functioned for several years. Since 2018, our demands for authentic historical truths has matured and brought various lost pages and events forward. We go where the scholarship and interests take us. Tonight, we are going back in time into a world lost in the muck and mire of racially militarized hatred and war. Under the sway of an autocrat, millions lost their lives and the map of the world changed. Europe was under siege, and consequently, their colonial possessions were drawn in. Places of natural resources were seized. The military machinery of the German state facilitated the bottomless revenge and cruelty, first turned on its own people and others. Some rationalized that they could work with Hitler, manipulate him, achieve their own personal goals. They were mistaken. This personalized political machinery of the state, using the boundless energy of the state, brought the world to its knees. Are we now living in deja vu? Tonight, we will try to do two things. Dror Kahn will tell us his thoughts, which, among other things, will focus on his mother's journey through years of hell, through the Third Reich and her ultimate survival. And secondly, we hope to generate with you thought and conversation about the direction that this country is heading. We want the contributions of the Q&A to be civil and thoughtful, as I know you will be. By the way, Mr. Kahn has been a member of the Brooklyn Society of Ethical Culture since 1980. He is a graduate of the Humanist Institute. He is a skilled bibliographer and a nascent writer. This book, The Linden Still Bloom, is his second book. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dror Kahn.
Thank you, Miriam. I put up the slide of the bones of Lucy, and what I always wondered as a child, is it just chance that I'm I and you are you? Is it possible I would have been somebody else? We could have just changed places. It was, as a child, it really mystified me. For some reason, this is not advancing slides. Go like this, okay. When I think of Lucy's children, the message is that each of us is like a light. You're a light, and all of us together make one light. You cannot really separate one candle, one person's light from all the other lights, like the lights in a candelabra. They make one light, we're one person's. This talk is in a context of what's happening now in the world and my mother's story of the Holocaust. How is it that the unthinkable is possible? Gradualism was required. This is from Hannah Arendt. First, future perpetrators had to be progressively lured into finding unthinkable acts, not only thinkable, but necessary. Can you connect that to anything happening now? Second, the targets of persecution also had to be subtly removed from the realm of legal, national, and ultimately moral obligation. Think about those steps in the process as we hear this story of my mother. I'm going to begin by reading the preface that I wrote for the book. I couldn't have been older than 4. I was straddled on Abba's father's shoulders, holding onto his forehead. It was the afternoon hour that I spent with my parents. Usually, Ima, mother, and Abba would play with me, but today Ima was napping and we were outside from the buildings and the other people in the kibbutz. Abba pointed at our long shadows on the ground and waved. Magically, the shadow waved back. I raised my arm and waved to the shadow. He lifted me over his head and put me down. That is us, Dror and Abba. And I asked, why Dror? Why is that my name? And he squatted so we were face to face because of what happened to Ima during the war. Dror means liberty. So I knew from the very earliest age that my mother had suffered something traumatic, so horrible. They named liberty after her, but I never talked to her about it. Never. I knew that I was a son of a Holocaust survivor. How could I not know that? But that was not something that I explored with my mother. So, how is it that I wrote a book about the Holocaust, her memoir? There are close to 20,000 Holocaust books and Holocaust memoirs. It's a niche. It's in museums. It's all over. How come so many? Well, the Holocaust was widespread. The Nazis had roughly 42,000 camps and ghettos for labor and killing. No wonder there's so many people who wrote books about it. But why this book? When my parents moved to a retirement community in Florida, they left me with a box full of papers to go through. Most of it was like warranties for the refrigerator, things like that. But there was also a folder of my mother's writings. She had started a memoir when she was in 1980, so she was, it's 40 years ago. And when I found it, I said, wow, this is I didn't know my mother wrote. And I started to inquire more about what her story was. And I remembered that in June, I didn't remember the date, but in 1996, my mother was interviewed for the Shoah Foundation. Steven Spielberg started, and these are all over. Columbia has it, there are many of, Yad Vashem has these kind of recordings of testimonials of survivors. 1996, they gave me a DVD. I hardly remembered it. It wasn't until roughly 2007 or so that it was put on YouTube, and by the time I found it on YouTube and watched it, my mother's video had been seen tens of thousands of times. I was blown away, especially when I started to read the comments. There were hundreds of comments of people who saw the video, and they were blown away. She is so inspirational and witty. I've watched many of these interviews now, and she was so captivating. I kept wishing she had written her own book. And I thought, this is something that I could do. I could finish her memoir for her. I had her video, I had what she had written, and she had also written a very exciting chapter in this book called Muted Voices, Stories of Survivors of Latvia. And the chapter was Escape in Disguise, so I had material to work with. And I took it on. It was before my mother died. She died in 2018, and I remember telling her, Mom, I didn't like Ima, I'm starting a book about what you had written and the video. I said, why would you want to do that? But it took me all that time to write it. I tried in different drafts, different formats, should I focus on just the exciting, suspenseful, unique things to her story, or should I tell the story the way she wrote it, like a memoir? I even tried a graphic novel. This is a sketch. I went through the whole thing. I'm not much of an artist, but when I look at this now, I'm actually pretty proud of it. It's not that bad, right? So here's her story. My mother, Rosa Sachs, Rose, thank you for the roses here. In this picture, she's 14 years old. It's a school portrait. She grew up in Liepāja, Latvia. Latvia is on the Baltic Sea, the end of the Gulf Stream, warm climate. Notice that Germany is relatively close, and it was a Germanified place. The key language was German. That's what the middle class spoke. And in the picture on the right, that's the map of the city. You could see it has a harbor. It's a waterfront spot. And notice Sked in the top, that beach. We'll see that later, why that's featured. Liepāja in German is Liebau. The Liebau tree is the linden tree. It has beautiful flowers in the spring, and the flowers, my mother said, would fall down like snowflakes, and the perfume filled the air of this space. Liepāja's symbol is a lion leaning against the linden tree. My mother lived in a house 2 stories high behind that big red building over there on the left. That was the Edelstein's house. That comes up in the story too. This is her family just after her little sister was born, so that must have been about 1934, 36, something. Her mother's name was Sophie, and her father's name was Chaim Sachs. The town had a harbor. It had a very cosmopolitan area. There were many, many tourists that came there. It was very sophisticated, with beautiful buildings, big shops, tailor shops, and she writes about shopping. But the key thing that brought people there was that it had a beach. The sand was so tight and white and smooth, it squeaked under her feet, she wrote. And the water was shallow, and the children could go out deep into, not deep, but far into the water and still play among the sandbars and frolic with the little fish. It was a pretty idyllic spot. This is a park, and it had a swan pond, really a mecca for culture in that part of the world, and a lighthouse. We'll be back at the lighthouse later. Oh boy. Liepaja had a synagogue. It was torn down by the Nazis during the war. It had roughly 7,000 Jews before the war, but my mother's family was not religious. It was secular, but she did go to a Hebrew school, and they did celebrate Jewish holidays. She writes this: the biggest holiday was Pesach, Passover. This is a whole other story. The first Passover I remember when I was probably 5. We were going to have the Seder meal with our neighbors, the Edelsteins, in their big house on the street, but still our house had to be made ready. And she tells her mother, if you know about Jewish culture, you have to clean all the breadcrumbs, the chametz out of the house, clean everything, all the dishes, make sure there's not a crumb. Even though they weren't religious, her mother did that. She went to the market with a helper, and they came back with loaded baskets, including a large live carp that was wrapped in a burlap sack. She put the fish in the bathtub with enough water to cover it. I thought it was another animal for me to play with, like the ones father rescued. I leaned over the tub, petting it and cooing it reassuringly as the creature stared up at me with trusting, unblinking eyes. I was certain the fish understood me. To my horror, the next day, Mother unceremoniously brought the lovely creature to the kitchen, gave it a couple of whacks on the head with the rolling pin, sliced open its silken white belly to pull out the innards, snipped off the fins and scraped off the scales. All the while, its glassy eyes still stared at me. It was my introduction to killing. In this photo, this I would say is the end of the high school years, and my mother is the one without the hat. She tells of growing up. She was a loudmouth, an actress, a performer. She was not the shy, quiet one. And as I look at this, I wonder why is she the only one without a hat? Is this a telling thing about her personality? One day, roughly at this age, their innocence was broken. Some men came from Palestine, as was done. They were called shlichim. They were sent over from Palestine to bring the story of what Jews were doing in the new country, Zionists, and try to recruit new people to go to Israel, to make Aliyah, what it was called. And they showed her pictures of what was happening in Austria and Germany at that time. The blocking of stores were labeled Jews, do not shop in Jewish stores. Jews are like spiders, spreading their web throughout all of Europe. The Jews spread from one spot all over, they were taking over. The replacement theory, it sounds like, doesn't it? Jews were shamed. He's a racial defiler. I can't help but think of the quote, you have to bring down the victims so that you could then do what you need to do to them. There were book burnings. On one side, I'm caught with that happy look of these boys in their white uniform. They must belong to a club. And look at the other side, the size of that bonfire, the size of the crowd. The Jewish press humiliation, clean the sidewalks. And as I look at this photo, the guys in the back, the smilers, who maybe caught the fact that there's a camera there, like between those two soldiers, there's a guy with a really big smile looking right at the camera. This humiliation was purposeful, it was intentional, it was not like it was a plan, and it was not happening in one spot. Soon after, Hitler and Stalin made a plan, a non-aggression agreement. They would not go to war against each other. They had plans, but we will not attack each other. And I can't help but think about now our own government making deals with the enemy, and will it really last? Wonder how long the honeymoon will last. Well, the Russians had their peace with Latvia, with the Germans, and very soon after, within a few weeks, or literally that same month, Germany declared war on Poland, and they attacked. My mother says they heard it on the radio, and the announcer was crying on the radio, the war has started. She's at this point still a kid. Like, what does this even mean? What does war mean? What does it mean? My parents seem all confused and looking at each other, and they don't know what to say, and don't talk about this in front of the kids, but the war begins. Russia saw this as an opportunity to invade Latvia and the other Baltic countries and take over for the protection of those Baltic countries, because the Germans were now their allies. If you were under the Russian umbrella, you'll be safe. And they moved in, and they made this building was called the Blue Wonder. They had their own secret police, the NKVD, and people did not know what to be afraid of. They knew they had to be afraid of the Russians, the NKVD. They were communists. They were throwing people in jail. The NKVD, that building, the Blue Wonder, immediately put bricks on the windows so it could be a safe place to torture people, and people did not come out. I took this picture this summer when I went to Latvia for a reunion of Jews of Latvia, and I was told, interestingly to me, that the building on the left, that red brick building, became the German police SD headquarters. All in the same square, right in the middle of town. This isn't like in some secret, hard to reach place, a few blocks away from where she lived. The Russians, in June of that year, got rid of their enemies in the Baltic countries. It was over one night or so, and she says how she came to school one day, and she was had just studied for an exam with her best friend Asya, who was a math genius, who told her everything. She came to school expecting to take the test, and nobody was there. The first thought was, wow, they're going to call off school, great, no exam, we're going to pass, everybody passes, terrific. But then she realized, no, people have been evicted. They're gone. Evicted isn't, I don't know if that's even a good word for that. They were put on trains like this and taken to Siberia, which she knew at that point was a horrible, horrible place where you don't escape. That's where the Russians bring things. And she ran and biked to the train station and looked to reach her Asya to say goodbye, and he was gone, and she cried. And she ends that segment saying she had no idea that he was one of the lucky ones, because what was going to happen to them was going to be much, much worse. Less than a year later, the Germans attacked Russia. That peace treaty didn't have deep roots. They moved into her family, not really, this is like a real thing. What do you do if all of a sudden a war starts? Where do you go? What do you do? So you hope your parents have some good ideas and know what to do. Well, the parents said, let's go to the basement of the Edelstein's house, the bigger house. And that's where they spent 7 days hoping that they will survive the bombing, which got bigger and bigger and bigger. And I could have shown you many pictures of Liepaja after the bombings. And when we went this summer, the person who gave us a tour said, you see all these empty lots? That's because they didn't rebuild after World War II and the bombings. Very soon after the Germans arrived, they made rules for Jews, preparing the perpetrators to understand that some people just aren't worth the attention. All Jews must wear an easily recognizable yellow star marking of no less than 10 centimeters. When I think about it, they took measurements? I mean, like how precisely, like what kind of thinking? All men from 16 to 60 must report to work at the fire station. Shopping time for Jews is 10 to 12. Jews are allowed to leave their quarters only from 10 to 12 and then 3 to 5. No public parks. When you see a German in the street, leave the sidewalk. Jews are forbidden to use public transportation. Jewish shops must have a sign, Jewish business, 20 centimeters big. Jews must turn in all their radios, means of transportation, uniforms, weapons, and typewriters. Jews could only go to Jewish doctors, and Jews disobeying these orders will be treated with utmost severity. There were also signs saying that for every German that was wounded, for every act of sabotage, 10 Jews will be killed. For every killed German, 100 Jews would be killed. They had to start catching some Jews and putting them in some place where they could get them to accomplish you because you need to kill them. Now that you've said you're going to do it, there was no one to turn to for help. This struck me very much. Like you can't talk to your parents. Your parents know less than anybody else. What do your parents know what to do? The police are now the enemy. There's nobody. You're on your own. I'm going to read you this section of what she wrote about turning in the radio. The order to deliver the radios to the police station was to deliver the radios to the police station. The whole family was in the room when Father unplugged it and neatly coiled up the cord. Father and Mother looked at each other and then gave me the task of taking it down to the station. I was a good and obedient child, so as if I was returning books to the library, I carried our radio to the station. Nazis now manned it. I entered. Before me was a desk, and standing next to it was a man who seemed miscast. He looked so very ordinary, even though he was wearing a pressed military uniform and high-polished leather boots. He had on an officer's hat. Carrying the radio, I approached him and saw that above the hat's visor was a metal pin. It was the first time I saw this, a skull and crossbones. The skull was grinning at me. Yikes, this wasn't a costume. This was for real. That's the guy, Eric Handke. Beneath the visor was the face of Eric Handke, who was to become our worst executioner. He was standing stiffly with a hungry air. He was frightening. My stomach tightened. Yet, like the good girl I was taught to be, I politely asked him, "Where do you want me to put the radio?" He glared down at me with such an expression of disgust that without another peep, I just dropped the radio and fled. This was the Jewish Star. These rules were happening all over Europe, wherever the Germans came into power. The picture of the two children was in Antwerp, and the man is in Berlin. And what my mother realized and says is that you didn't have to feel diminished by this badge of being Jewish. And her aunt, Aunt Minna, who was a seamstress, a tailor, a very high-end designer of clothes, sewed them silk yellow badges that they wore with the kind of pride. And my mother says she was happy when she saw a German to walk in the street. Who would want to share a sidewalk with those terrible people? In the mornings, they reported to work at the fire station. This is it. She tells that she went to different jobs. The book is full of anecdotes and stories. She was a very good storyteller. But one story that stuck out is that for a time she worked in a lumber yard. She was the only Jewish person there with a Jewish star, and she saw a man staring at her. He was wearing black. He looked kind of menacing. She was scared. I mean, she's with a Jewish star, like he has every reason to be scared. But then he came over and stood and started talking to her. He was a sailor on a Danish ship that was leaving in 3 days, and he offered to smuggle her out if she'd want to do it. At this point, she's a child, a teenager. What do you do? What would you do? I mean, the situation is really pretty bad there in Latvia, but what do? You said, I'll go talk to my parents and figure out what to say to you, what to do. Do I go on that? It's a whole story. I want you to read the book, so I'm not going to tell you what happens. Is that fair? I'm sorry. Then became their actions. Actions. That's what it was called. It had a name. It was like happening. This is Wikipedia. Wherever you look, actions. This is not like her word. Right behind the conquering German army came special units with the job of killing Jews. They recruited locals into the auxiliary police to help round up the Jews. They had quotas for the number of Jews to be killed. These actions were organized Jew hunts. They happened a few times a week, unannounced. In the beginning, it was just like grab some people in the street, but that became harder and harder to do. Disclaimer, I'm not 100% sure. The caption where I found this photo said, this is an action they're rounding up. It sure looks like it, but I'm not sure. Maybe they're all running for something. But let's assume this is what it was like. They're trying to catch Jews. They had to hunt them down. They needed to bring them in. One day, her father didn't come home. We heard rumors that I'm reading from the book. We heard rumors that the Jewish men were being held in the big women's prison. This is in the center of town. Perhaps they were being made to go to work for the Germans. That would make sense. This gave Mother an idea. She handed me a pair of father's shoes, and she said, go to the prison and say these shoes are for Chaim Sachs, for father. This sounded very reasonable. Mother was always the one who knew what to do. I didn't question why she was sending me instead of going herself. As with the radio, off I went, this time to the infamous women's prison, with father's shoes in my hands. The prison is a big brick building that we would normally avoid. I rang the bell at the main door and an old Latvian guard opened it. He stared at me in disbelief that I voluntarily came to this dangerous spot. I began to say that I brought the shoes for Chaim Sachs, hoping that in this way I would find out if he's really inside the prison. The guard grabbed the shoes as if I had brought them for him, and in an angry, warning voice told me to run home and never show my face there again. We never saw or heard from father again. For a long time, we didn't know what had happened to him. Everyone needed to find a way to avoid capture. The actions began catching people in the street, so people stayed off the street. Makes sense. So they started to go and catch people at home. So people stayed out of their house and just came home to sleep. So they started to have the actions in the middle of the night. And so people didn't stay home at night. They had to have a place to hide. They had to have a place to run to, or a sympathetic or paid neighbor who would hide you, a Christian who would hide you. The thought of quotas, and when we hear that word being said today about deportations, we need quotas, we have to get a certain amount, makes me sick, because we should all be sick. That was an aside. Another thing that would keep you safe was to have an Ausweis ID pass that declared you an essential person. Electricians had it, some plumbers, different people. There were people who cleaned and maintained the offices for the Nazis had it. And also my mother's aunt, Minna, who, this is a photo of her. She, as I told you, had a very fancy salon, a fashion salon, and she had many the wives and mistresses of German SS people who needed clothes made for them. So she had an Ausweis. And because there was so much work doing the sewing, my mother and her mother and the sisters and the other aunts were all safe because Minna could have them in the back sewing. So my mother did not need to have a hiding spot, but these hiding spots were necessary. We know that from Anne Frank had a hiding spot in an attic. There would be behind staircases. There would be under the floor. There would be behind cabinets. And here is David Zivkan, who was a pretty remarkable man. We'll hear about him a little later again, showing a photograph of where he hid, having a visual record of what it was necessary to avoid capture at this time. You had to have a word for the kind of place you needed, a secret hiding place to hide from the Germans, needed a word of its own. Okay. This is one I'm giving you. I should have said this before. The Holocaust is ugly. There's things you may not want to see. It's at one level, I'm afraid that by showing things, it becomes a kind of Holocaust porn of seeing the terrible things. So don't look if you don't want the memories, because what the Germans did was horrible. And it was not in secret. It was by the lighthouse, which was by the beach in the summer. So there are people writing in diaries of coming back from the beach and hearing a commotion, or hearing some shooting, and deciding to go over and see what it was, and they just couldn't believe it. Truck after truck coming by with Jews, and the Jews are unloaded and taken and shot. And I'm going to play you this video, and it's a minute and a half. It's a filmmaker, a guy, a tourist who traveled around with a camera, happened to be there and saw this happening. It was one of the days of many days when this was happening, and he filmed it. He was interviewed, what happened when you did it? And he was a little bit apologetic. I didn't make such a good movie. I didn't have the sequencing really right, but this is the best I could do. There they are, being unloaded from trucks. And please pay attention to the tourists, the spectators, the people who think this is like cool. And the question is, what would we do? What would you do? What would I do if I was going someplace and I saw this happening? It's kind of official. These are soldiers and police officers doing this. This isn't like hoods. I mean, what would you do? Would you stand and watch? I mean, you'd be an idiot to protest. This is the normalcy, the normalcy of the evil that was done back then. One group after another, they go into the ditch, the trench, and then they're covered with sand, and the next group comes in. And what amazes me as I watch this is that the people didn't run away. They just they did what they were supposed. I don't know what I would do. Is there any point in running away? Is it like scatter? A remarkable film. I'm sorry, you could open your eyes if you were watching that. The job my mother eventually got was in a big cork factory that was right next to the water by the harbor, and it was used, the Germans took it over and turned it into a depot to give uniforms and blankets and things to the new sailors. a story. She tells about what it was like working there with mostly other young women. And these young women, there were some German older people in charge. And these older men knew how to take advantage, how to find girlfriends among these younger women. And the younger women needed protection. You needed to find a way to stay alive, because otherwise they needed Jews killed. You'd be sent out, fill the quota. One time she was standing there, and a sailor was coming in for his uniform, and he had a little pet dog in his hand, and he was feeding him chocolates. And she blurted out, "You're feeding him chocolate? Well, you kill us Jews?" And right away she was taken to the head office. And it could have been the end of her life. To see what happens, you know what to do. I'm sorry, it's very commercial of me, right? I'm sorry. Okay. December of that year, so we're not talking long periods of time, there were rumors spreading that the Germans had dug a long ditch, perhaps a kilometer long, someplace by the beach. Scared is where it turns out, where we looked on the map before. And the ad said, Jews must stay at their homes. Monday, the 15th of December, then Tuesday, by the order of the SS police. And they did. And she says that I'm reading. From her room the night before, Mother kept urging me to turn off the light and get some sleep. What a strange logic adults have, I thought. Here, Mother expected that the very next day we would get shot, but she still wants me to go and get enough sleep. She thinks I need to be awake, like a good going to school. I got under the blankets and read until my eyes closed, and I drifted off. Not long after, there was banging on the doors. They came for us. It was before dawn, dark and freezing. At the door were not Germans, but the Latvian auxiliary police. We weren't surprised, we were expecting them. These police were very polite, like they knew that if they'd make a big roughhousing and ruckus about gathering the Jews, it'll be much more difficult than if you just read the names, come out, and we'll take attendance. We were led in the garden out to the street where we saw our Jewish neighbors herded together, waiting for us to join them, their breath visible in the freezing air, their eyes not making contact. Being the clown that I was, at the last minute I exclaimed, "Oh, how can I go on a trip without my lipstick?" I meant it as a joke, but the police, still playing the charade that we were on an excursion, took me seriously, and politely, one of them told me to hurry up and go get it. I ran back across the yard, back to the house, and Aunt Minna opened the door. Remember, Aunt Minna did not have to go. She had that important past. But her aunts are gone, her little sister Miriam, her grandfather, they've all been called out of the house to go. I rummaged around looking for the lipstick. Meanwhile, Mother, as if not comprehending what was happening, called for me to hurry so I wouldn't be left behind, though that would have been the very best thing. What happened to Mother? How much more clever if she would have said, "Don't worry, we'll go, she'll catch up to us." We did not have far to walk. The women's prison was only about 20 minutes away. So they walked across the freezing cobblestone, older people slipping and helping each other with the Latvian guards, and they came into the prison yard. This is that same woman's prison, which was already full of Jews. The friendly, air quotes, Latvian police left them, the Jews, with Latvian police who did not need to pretend that everything was going to be nice. These guys were drunk, their breath fog coming out of their faces, beating people. And they told the Jews, line up, face the wall, do not talk, do not move. Of, of course, if you have your children with you, if you're looking for your relatives, you do have that urge to go and talk to them. But she does say, maybe we're better off not being allowed to talk, because what would we say? What would we do? A miracle happened. I mean, my mother does not believe in miracles, but a miracle happened and they were saved. They did not have to go and have happen to them what happened to the close to 7,000, 5,000 that were trucked away. I'm going to now warn you that this is a time to maybe close your eyes again. Because in a minute, remember David Zivkon, who was having his picture taken? He was an electrician, so he had a pass. While he was in the ghetto, which the ghetto happens a little later, so this happened later, he had a job to do some wiring repair in this house that was the headquarters, the home of a big shot German. And in this big shot German's an SS officer. His name is known, not just like you don't need to know it, and I don't either. He found rolls of film, negatives. He probably held them to the light, saw what they were, decided to steal them, take them back to the ghetto. The ghetto was not a place that you didn't have, so there was a basement, there were things that could be done, we had friends. They made copies of the film, buried the film, and then he went back to this SS officer's house saying, I forgot to do some important wiring, brought back the film and put it back where he had found it. I'm going to show you the pictures of what had happened to the Jews that were trucked away. So this is unusual because pictures of these things exist. Actually, it's like somebody thought this is like cool to take pictures of. If you don't want to look, I don't blame you. They were trucked over and put to the beach, freezing December. Look how warmly that Latin auxiliary policeman is dressed. They're huddling together. Groups of people waiting. They don't know what's going to happen to them, but it can't be good. Oh boy. They were told to undress. The clothing was collected and put into piles that were taken away. I mean, there's photos of that too. This family was ordered to pose by a man with a whip standing outside the frame. This is not like, it's not natural that people would pose in a situation like this. You'll notice these are mostly women, if not almost all women, because the men had been killed already during the actions. There are very few men left. I can't imagine what's that piece of paper that he's handing over there. The soldier, his job is to go and push the corpses into the ditch. Unbelievable. This was done over 2 days. Overnight, the people who were there but hadn't yet been killed, because the Germans couldn't work all the time, they had to take breaks. Overnight, they was kept in a shed. This location was a military rifle range, practice range. So they had some infrastructure. The previous massacre that I showed you was the lighthouse was in town. That wasn't such a great idea, it turns out, when you wanted to do this on a much bigger scale. At the lighthouse, roughly 2,000 people were killed over 2 weeks. This was now 5,000. And in the horrible research that I did for this, it's horrible because of the things that is now in my head. They showed that this was happening all over where the Germans were. This wasn't rare. This was all over. And in some places, the ditches weren't big enough to hold all the Jews that were now going to be killed. So they stacked them like cords of wood, nice and neatly, so you could fit more in. there's more, the German, in the book, the Germans had to perfect better ways of doing this job of killing all the Jews. This was not high tech, this was not industrial level, and worst of all, the soldiers didn't like doing this. They were getting got a book called Perpetrators and Collaborators and Bystanders. And it had letters from the soldiers, and they were complaining. This is filthy work, it's very tiring. All day long, standing there, shooting people, the blood, the brains splattering along. They were even committing suicide, so the Germans had to come up with better ways of doing it, including gas tanks, trucks, that people would be put into trucks and taken to their work site, and while they're going, the gas would be turned on. That was an improvement. Originally, they trucked them over and then put the gas in. And then somebody said, this is a better idea. We could gas them as they're being transported, and by the time they get there, all we got to do is empty the truck and clean it. That was working pretty good. You know why they didn't keep doing it? They couldn't keep up the manufacturing of the trucks fast enough. Remember, this is all over Europe. It's not like little Liepāja with its 700,000 people. That's a small number of people. This is just an example of what was happening. At Skagit Beach, recently, they built this memorial to remember the spot. We were there this summer. And there are people who say, prove it. Prove there were Jews buried there. Where were the Jews buried? And a scientist came, his name was Philip Reeder. We met him over the summer. And this is what they're doing. They're using kind of a radar device to search underground for where the earth has been disturbed to make trenches. Because the religious law is that you cannot dig up a corpse. That was forbidden. Liepāja, unlike other places, because in Liepāja, first they had the massacre and then they had the ghetto. This was not the way it was in other places. So now in Liepāja, from 7,000, there were only 800 Jews left. It didn't need a big ghetto. So here it is in a kind of, ghettos were put in parts of its communities that were bad, cheap housing. They threw the people out and moved people in. Why did the Germans put the Jews in ghettos? One, easier to control them. And two and three, it's close to railroad stations and easy for the next step, which is to take them someplace else for something beyond just keeping them for a while. This is a Liepāja ghetto on the left. There's a little boy there on top of the roof, and I wonder what he's thinking. He's a photographer. And on the right, that sign says, basically, you can't enter or exit the ghetto. That's actually in the Riga ghetto. So what I'm doing in this talk and in the book is I'm not focusing only on pictures that illustrate my mother's story, but that illustrate the story. I should have said in the beginning, one of my goals in the book is to combine the history with my mother's story, not only her story, because I think it's amazing. This is a ghetto, I don't know where, and the sign says, ghetto entering or leaving forbidden. And as you see in this ghetto, there wasn't a fence or a wall. That was some ghettos. And there was trading going on between people in the ghetto and people outside the ghetto. Ghetto life, from my mother's point of view, was not so miserable. They were given a small apartment that they shared with other families, and immediately they put up partitions to turn big rooms into small rooms. Every room had 3 families or something. They shared the kitchen, they shared the bathroom. They managed to live. It was doable. Maybe you made new friends, new romances. There was a little infirmary. But there were also horrible things happening. One time, this Mrs. Rubenstein came to the ghetto, and for some reason she was arrested. It didn't matter why. She looked somebody the wrong way, somebody said a rumor about it, doesn't really matter. She was taken away and complained, I need my children with me, I need my children with me. So Eric Handke, who we saw, that bad man, like Haman, you see, came with a car with two other guys, and he said, Mr. Israelite, who was the head of the ghetto Jewish leaders, bring over the children of Mrs. Rubenstein. So he brought over the two kids. They cried, we don't want to leave, we don't want to leave, when they saw the police car. The SS grabbed them, threw them like bags of laundry in the back of the car and took them away. And the next we see them, Mrs. Rubenstein, naked, is coming to the spot where she's going to be executed, carrying her two children. Horror beyond horror. This is the Liepāja ghetto. Don't know what this is, but that's what it is. At around the same time, the Germans started to liquidate their ghettos. That's the word, the euphemism. This is a bigger ghetto, much bigger than the Liepāja ghetto. People were told, tomorrow you leave. Take what you could carry. You're going. You don't know where. You don't know what to take. What would you take? Some people took cooking utensils, some people took clothes, everybody took their jewelry, what they think they might need, hide their jewelry in their clothes. This is a Krakow ghetto. Again, much, much bigger than the Liepāja ghetto. The Warsaw ghetto, the first ghetto, had 40,000 Jewish inhabitants. This is like a city. Here they were arriving at the cattle cars. The night before they left, my mother's little space was near the infirmary, the hospital in the ghetto, and all night long she heard screaming and crying because they were giving an abortion to somebody, to Mira, who was pregnant. You could not survive if you were pregnant. It was like a death sentence. Mira ended up dying in the cattle car between some people's feet. She ended up, my mother says she was watching as people that she knew from her apartment, Rosa and Emil, who had a small little boy born. Emil was begging his wife to get rid of the boy. I mean, I'm saying it too crudely. To give the boy away to a nice old lady who was doomed anyway. The old lady, he had already spoken to her. She was willing to take the child. And Roscoe did not want to give away her baby. What would you do? This is the arrival in Auschwitz at Yad Vashem, which is an archive of photographs, of incredible archive having to do with the Holocaust. There is an Auschwitz album of quite a few photographs. The Germans were taking pictures, making photographs, keeping a record, kind of like a nice documenting of what was going on. Because these are pretty well photographed photos. So we have this. It must have been something like this when my mother arrived in her camp. You could look inside the car and see that it's still crowded with people, and it's already crowded, and that face of that little child looking at the bottom, looking at us, and that old man with the bag. These people are waiting for the first, this is from the same album, they're waiting for the first selection. A selection is what was the euphemism, again, nice words for terrible things, of picking people that are going to be killed. You're selected, you die. You don't want to be selected. You want to be seen as strong enough to work. My mother's sister, Miriam, was roughly 10 years old at the time. Very vulnerable in terms of you can't work like you're to being selected. So and this, I've read other books, was a common thing, relatively common, that when you have a girl that age, you get her a little bra, you make her stand tall, you put things in her shoes, make her look older, and somehow be able to pass and stand behind people. And my mother says my mother was tall, she kept away from little Miriam because she didn't want to look like there's an old sister, like it would kind of show it off, and kind of maneuvered so a shorter person would stand next to Miriam. And this saved her. Miriam survived for the time being, got in. This is again from that same album, The Selection. Men on one side, women on the other, and now we go and we start separating who's going to go and work and who's going to go and not work. We know what that means. When I found this photo, it just gripped me. Their faces. These are women who are healthy, strong. They're not selected, chosen. I have to be careful what word I use. They were chosen for labor. And their faces of disgust and anger and fear, I'm not a good person to read faces, but I could only imagine what they're seeing. Their parents, their siblings, people they know that are not making it, that have not been chosen to work, that aren't strong enough. My mother and her mother and her aunt and Miriam, her sister, were chosen to work. They got through. Minna, the aunt, her housewife, did not save her when it came to this. She was in the ghetto. I didn't tell you, but Minna had a wooden leg. She was very beautiful. She was very talented as a seamstress. She was brilliant, everything about, and she was all the time falling in love and a wonderful person, everything, but with a wooden leg, she was selected, and they all knew it. They knew it would happen, and they had to look and watch Minna go there while you're going here. And the girl all the way on the right covering her face is how I feel at moments like this. Like, how could this be happening? They were sent to Kaiserwald. This is Kaiserwald. I have photos of some other places. They all look basically alike. And if you think, well, that doesn't look so big, look way to the right. There are more barracks. There are more buildings. It was built roughly for 3,000 people. Eventually it held 11,000. When they came in, they saw bunks like these. At the time, 3 levels high with 2 people in each bunk. This bunk was your space for everything. Not just where you slept. You didn't have other space. This is where you put your things. This is what you had. This is Kaiserwald's photo taken after it was liberated. And you could just see the size of this place, and this was just one barrack in one side of the room. The first morning, there was Derapel. Derapel is what was called, it's taking attendance, the count. Happened in the morning and happened after work, and it was not just to take the count, but also as a form of torture and punishment. While this is happening, the Germans, police, and the capos are the non-Germans who are given the job, generally hoods, thugs, who are also prisoners, but they weren't they got the job of being disciplinarian, bunk commander, bullies. They were Jewish capos, but they would go around making selections, beating people who talked, beating people who budged. The Germans took attendance, they had to get it exactly right. If there was a number missing, and with a crowd like this, you could imagine that would happen pretty often, that you don't have exactly right. We got to start all over and start counting again. So the standing there could take hours. As I look at this photo, and some of the women have their heads covered, it must be like broiling hot sun. And this is Derapel in the men's side. in another prison. These aren't soldiers on patrol. These are prisoners. Look at you know they've been standing there for a long time, and you know nobody's saying a word, and nobody's fidgeting because you don't want to call attention to yourself. Food was a big, big, big part of the concern and about the story, and of what was constantly on everybody's mind. How do I find food? Not just to keep myself, to satiate the hunger, but also to stay alive, because what they were feeding us, she says, was not enough to survive, and everybody knew that. And some jobs gave you a chance, which my mother was very lucky to get off the camp and to go out into other work sites. And then you were lucky you might find some things to eat and maybe some extras, something somebody threw away. She tells of finding, coming back from work, finding some potatoes and deciding to smuggle them back into the camp, but she was afraid to smuggle them in. But her little sister she thought would have it easier. She'd be able to squeeze the potatoes under her arms and get through the gate and not be pulled over. My mother was the guilt of risking your sister's life because you're afraid. Close call, we'll leave it at that. There was another time, my mother writes about a very moving part, that she often told this story, that one time she was given the job of ladling the soup to the prisoners. All these, you see they're holding containers to get the dish. And everybody knows that if they run out of food, if you're at the end, you're not getting any. And everybody's watching how it's being done. The ladler is supposed to go once from the bottom, where there might be some thicker things, maybe even a piece of turnip or dead horse meat, whatever, and once from the top. That was your portion. And my mother's doing this, and she's ladling away, and everybody's watching her, and her mother is online, getting closer and closer. And she thinks to herself, what will I do? Do I give my mother 2 portions from the bottom and maybe even kind of fish around and find something to give her? And she could see her mother expecting that. But everybody's looking at her, and people are yelling, and people are screaming, and hurry up, and whatever. Read the book. The hunger was so incredible. This is like that she says she saw her mother eating grass, even though grass. If you like, cows and horses can eat grass. They have different digestive systems. Human beings cannot eat grass and not be sick. She writes a segment on what she learned, how she learned what to do to survive. And she said, I watched what the other people did, the strong ones, the healthy ones, and I did what they did. And I did not do what the sickly and the weak ones, who you could see the writing on the wall, they will be selected. So she said, I saw that what you do is you don't work hard. Even though your nature, if somebody gives you a job, you want to show that you're a good worker, you don't work hard, you save your energy. And you keep away from the Musulmaner, the people who are so walking death. And when you look at this picture, it's another one of, I don't know why, all those men there are in that condition. They didn't go to work, obviously, that day. You don't want to be next to, you cannot be kind, you cannot be sympathetic, you cannot share and be nice to somebody who's weak and needs food. First of all, you need it yourself. She said she once found extra piece of bread. She shared it with her bunkmate, and her mother beat her. She said, how could you give it to a stranger? This was a friend from school. How could you, look, this is for us. We need this food. Keep away from the Musulmaner, because when they start walking around selecting, remember the selecting is they gotta get Jews, they gotta get a bunch of them. They're not gonna be careful and say, well, look, you're kind of okay, but they might start, I'm sorry, they start grabbing people, and you don't wanna be next to somebody who's going to get grabbed. This is my mother and her family before then, and I'm going to read you a section. And it's one day they had the big selection, a major selection at the camp. She was there for about a year, so this is not like, we're skipping along in time. The big selection, there were many of us, they put out a platform, like a little stage, and an important doctor who was all dressed up. They had a big party the day before. Everybody was kind of drunk and a little hungover and rosy. They had a big party the night before, and now they're going to have the big selection. They're going to weed out, cull the population. There were many of them reading. There were many of us, and the selection took a long time. All the while the doctor, the camp SS, and the helpful criminal prisoners were in good spirits, the capos. They were joking and conversing. I stood in the crowd like everyone else. Mother was hanging on to me with Miriam next to her. Ahead of us was a girl from my class who was with her mother. The doctor sent the girl to one side for the condemned, but the girl said, and the girl to the other, but the girl refused to leave her mother and went with her to the side of the condemned. She must have known it was her death. When it was my turn, I moved up and stood before the doctor. He looked at me with amazement. I was blonde, tall, with a light complexion. I looked like Hitler's dream girl. You couldn't ask for a better example of Aryan womanhood. Surprised, the doctor says to me, "You aren't Jewish, are you? What are you doing here?" And I said in perfect German, I forgot to say, or did I say they spoke German where she was? This was German, was her mother tongue. She says, "What do you think I'm doing here, doctor? I'm here in beautiful Kaiserwald on vacation." He laughed, and all the guards, the thugs, started to talk, and one of them says, "Oh, don't believe her, she's just like all the rest of them. She's one of them." He was willing to send me to death. But the doctor sent me to the side of the living, as you could tell, because she's here to write this book. Her mother and sister kind of stuck along and went with her, and her mother was furious. She was shuddering at the very idea that I was sarcastic to a man who might not take a joke and would think nothing of sending us to death. The woman in the back is Minna, and that's my mother with the collar, her mother, and little Miriam. The Germans were losing the war. They were losing badly, especially on the Eastern Front. The Russians were starting to come towards, Kaiserwald was in Latvia, which, if you remember the map, it was in the east, and now they're getting closer and closer to Kaiserwald in those camps, and the Germans know they got a problem. First of all, they've been committing crimes against humanity. Even they knew this is like not something you want the Russians to find us doing. Second, they thought, we might need these prisoners as hostages to do some bargaining later on. In any case, they started to evict the camps from the east further to the west. Stutthof was in Poland and was further west. Stutthof, I never heard of it until I started to do this. I've heard of Auschwitz, I've heard of Dachau, but Stutthof was one of that kind of camps, the death camps. You will leave here through that chimney, they were told. Stutthof had about 140 side camps, satellite camps, smaller camps for people to go and work for industries nearby. It's not common knowledge, maybe, I didn't know this, but the Germans were getting paid for the slave labor that they would rent out to these businesses or to the military to do these jobs. This wasn't like, oh, here's some slaves for you, go do some. This was like, it was business. I'm going like this. My mother ended up going to a satellite camp. It was the first thing she did. There was an announcement on one of their appels. They were being kept in Stutthof as just without anything to do. They were just kind of stored there waiting to die. But one day at the appel, an officer came in and said, we need 100 women to work at a construction site. And they were starting to pull women out, and there was one woman who was pulled out, and like it happened before. She said, I'm not going without my mother. So my mother, without thinking, oh, should I, shouldn't, whatever, without hesitation said, I'll go, I'll take. She volunteered to join that group to go to the satellite camp, someplace where they'll be working. And she says, and this is with a bit of guilt, I knew my chances to survive were better on my own than to be sticking with my mother and my little sister. I wanted to live. I don't know, I don't feel remorse and think she did the wrong thing, but it's questionable. All these other people sticking with their moms and with their sister. The horror. Stutthof had a cremation ovens like this, as you want to see this. And they had very, very tough guards. I included this because when I found it, I thought, let's look at the guards, the people who were administering these terrible beatings and killings and punishment. These women are now at trial after the war. Do you think they look capable of being monsters? Well, they were. So yes, the answer is, it's not what I think. They were. They were monsters. They became monsters. And what you have to think to yourself, what I do often is, could I, in the wrong situation, be a monster myself? If it would save my life, if it would save my child's life, if it would give me some power and some juice in my community. Am I any better than them? I should hope so, but I don't know. Neither did my mother know. The Russians were still advancing. It was getting closer and closer. They now the Germans had to get their prisoners further west, and death marches were created. Death marches, start walking. They were given a piece of bread. In my mother's case, it was snow, it was freezing, and they were wearing wooden clogs, and as she walked, the snow would stick to the bottom of the wooden shoe, and you'd have to beat it off and every few steps. Again, all over that part of Europe, not just a rare thing. And if you Google death marches, images, the number of images of carcasses on the side of the road, it's not like a rare photo, because this was now happening in communities, in town. They were out of the camps. The locals now knew what was going on. How could they not? They didn't know what was going on, but they see the dead bodies and they see these people walking by in prison gear, garb, and more and more miserable. The Germans did not leave anybody behind. If you were too tired to walk, if you collapsed because you were hurt, for whatever happened, they beat you or killed you, made you get up and keep walking, or they left you there not to die. They made sure you were dead. This was that's the way it was. Hard to fathom and hard to think about. I'm sorry to give you such a downer talk. This is a picture of overnight, I imagine, during the death march. At night they'd find a shed or something and people would have to stay and somehow stay alive. And you see there's no babies and children in this crowd and no men. The men are gone in this group, in my mother's circle. The death marches passed through cities and towns. Later that afternoon, I'm reading, we passed another village where again there was a group of people who had come out to watch our ghastly procession. As I passed, I looked at their faces, wondering what they thought of us. I caught the eye of a man in work clothes. He surreptitiously waved me to come over. I thought he might have something for me to eat, so hopefully I stepped to the side of the road, pretending to fix my shoe. He came and stood near me, but so as not to draw attention, did not look at me. Without an introduction, he point blank asked me why I didn't run away. He might just have been curious. You think I should, I said. I made a gesture at my clothes. She was wearing the striped pajama clothes, the hair cut close. By the way, the hair was shaved to get rid of lice, because lice was spreading typhus. The Germans weren't doing it to protect the Jews from getting typhus. The Jewish slaves were being sent out to work in factories where there were German people, out and other workers. The fear was that the typhus would spread into the German community. That's why they cut the hair. No, it's beyond words. Where would I go? I'm reading. Will you help me? He stepped back and I thought he was walking away, which was a reasonable thing to do. But a moment later, he came back and he gave me a piece of paper with an address written on it. Come tonight, do it. Be brave. Escape or you will surely die. I held a scrap of paper hidden in my fist. Stopping to talk to me had been a very dangerous thing for this man to do. Talking to a Jew could mean your death. The Nazis killed people as a punishment and also as a warning to others. They did it in public. They killed the whole family. Killing people was like the ambience. This is what you did. Like, it was sick time. Of course, I knew that if I would get caught trying to escape, I would be shot dead on the spot. But the guards walking alongside of me, of us, and at the rear were, the ones making sure that nobody alive stayed behind. They were tired and bored too. They'd been walking all this time as well. If I was going to do it, this was the chance. This was the opportunity. And after this, the book becomes her adventure story, because she did escape. And many things happened, and many of my friends who read the book say, Dror, just tell the story of her escape and that exciting, the stuff that people know about the Holocaust. They know all the stuff I told you, basically. I didn't tell you anything that many of you don't know. But this is where I'm going to stop this talk, because this talk is not revealing her unique story, but it's about this gradualism and what can become of people, the people who become the persecuted and the perpetrators. In my mother's story, it goes on and it tells about Operation Hannibal, which was a big evacuation. If you know the history, evacuation of the Germans' army. They were kind of cornered in a peninsula of Poland, and the Russians are coming, Some people say that the Russians did not want to bomb the escaping Germans because they wanted Germany to deal with all these evacuated people. Why kill them when we could have them go back to Germany and mess up their country to have all these refugees there? It's that Stalin was really playing three-dimensional chess. Who else plays three-dimensional chess? I shouldn't joke. This is her voyage. Her story continues. You could see she went from Liepaja to Kaiserwald to Stutthof concentration camp, the death camp. From there, with disguises, impersonating other people, through her acting ability, she made it to Berlin. She survived. She escaped. It's an amazing adventure story. From there, they made it to Stuttgart. They wanted to get out of the Russian zone. If you know, the history after Germany lost the war, the Allies divided up Germany into zones. The Russians were in the east, where Berlin was. The French, the British, and the Americans had areas in the west, and anybody who could went to the west if they didn't want to be with the Russians. The plan that the Allies had was that the refugees would be sent back to the countries they came from. My mother did not want to, at this point she knew her sister was dead. She did not know if her mother was still alive, but she had no interest in going back under the Russians, the Soviets, and she had no interest in seeing her Latvian neighbors ever again. So she and friends hitchhiked and made their way to Stuttgart. The story, the meat of the book, an exciting part, I'm going to skip with that. And to hint with this, I'm going to play the end of the video from my mother's interview for the Shoah Project, the epilogue. And now, if it plays, I need to press play. This is roughly 7 minutes. Sit back.
And in conclusion, I want to tell you, I'm really sad that this tragedy has happened, of course. And it is horrible for me to having lost my little sisters in such terrible circumstances and all that. But if it had to happen, really, if it was in the stars that should have happened to other Jewish people, I'm kind of grateful that I was there, and I'm grateful that I survived. But having been there and having seen that all and lived through it, it's enriched my life in many ways. First of all, I learned about people. I learned about people who were little people and grew to tremendous, with courage, tremendous heroes. And I know I can be happy to be Jewish because when I watch the Germans in certain situations, I was saying to myself, thank God I'm not a German. I'm not in there. I thank God I'm Jewish. I'm lucky I'm not a German. And when I meet now my German friends, young German friends who have a few of them, I feel sorry for them. When Susanne says, you cannot imagine, Shoshanchen, what the shame I have. And she's young, she has nothing to do with it. I feel bad for them because they have it on their conscience, they have it on their history. We don't so far.
I wanted to stop the... Whoop, I better keep going.
And I'm forever grateful to the people who helped. I'm forever grateful to every non-Jew who put his life at risk to save a total stranger, and I think about it, how would we have behaved? I don't know if I would have done the same things they did. The children, how could that have happened? How could that have happened? The little children, how could he have let it happen?
What do you think gave you the strength to survive?
Sense of humor, probably, and chutzpah. I was very lucky. I was at the right time, at the right age, with the right looks and the right personality. It has all added to survival. There are no miracles. I mean, I had it easier than lots of other people from that respect. So that probably helped a lot. And this conviction that it won't happen to me, this doesn't happen to me, it happens to anyone, not me. And so I never was really afraid. That's why I could play the chutzpah in the games. And acting was always something I wanted to do. So I acted Veronica, and I acted Catherine, and I acted this one or that one. So I acted Jean Simon, and so then the theater was over. It's true. It's true. I was a pretty good actress, and my knowledge of German. I mean, had I not known German that well, that very well, I could have made a boo-boo. I could have made a mistake and said I come from Stuttgart or Munich or what. I listened good how those people talked and picked a city which doesn't sound like anyone else. And that is clever for a young girl.
What advice do you have for your children, grandchildren, future generations?
The advice I have, enjoy life. Do the best you can for yourself without hurting other people. Have fun, have fun, have fun. And like Fritz said to me, who is my father-in-law, surround yourself with beautiful things. The ugly come on their own.
What message would you now like to deliver to the world?
I have no messages for the world. The world, who's going to listen to me? I mean, we always thought that it's never going to happen anything, and it does happen all the time, just this minute too. What message do I have to give them? It repeats itself. History repeats itself constantly. Somebody yesterday, a gentleman said to me, a friend of mine said, do you think Adolf Hitler was human? I said, yes, he was. How can you call him human? He's a beast, he's an animal. I said, no, Mitch, he's not. The problem is that he was human. He was a man, like you and anybody else. This is what's dangerous about people. He looked human. Eichmann looked human. Mendele looked human. They were probably good fathers and good family men. I know what happened. We were all in the same mess. To have grown up in Germany under Hitler, being a German, one didn't have many choices. It's not that they could go out and protest. I mean, the ones who did were beheaded in Plötzensee. Yeah? So it was not a why didn't they do anything, why didn't they say, it's very easy to ask that from New York. But to live under that kind of rule, with that threat, where your child could report you, and once he has joined the Hitlerjugend, that wasn't easy. That wasn't easy at all. So I have no complaints that so-and-so person didn't go out and march and protest. And I cannot go out and say a good German is a dead German. I know the games which were played. I know how the Hungarians behaved and how the Latvians behaved and how some of our Jewish people behaved in order to save their lives. If your life are at stake, you sell your own grandmother, which they often did, when it's happened, and your children you give away. Because the urge to live is very strong. So I don't sit in judgment of anybody. Just do the best you can. And don't hurt anybody. And don't hate anybody. And no prejudices.
This is the QR code to see the whole interview. It's 3 hours. I've had strange, real people went looking for me on Facebook and looking for my mother after seeing the video because she has a story, and you got the hint when she's talking about acting and playing Veronica and John Simone and these Katrina that she took on different parts. This is the story. That's what happens when she's now on her own, having escaped, with nobody to tell you what to do. That was like a big, big difference. When you're a prisoner, you have guards telling you what to do. The capos telling you what to do. Now she was maybe 20 years old, maybe still 19. I could do 1924, so in 1940, she was 20 years old. But luckily, it pays in some instances to look attractive. She made a very, very big point in the story. I'm just kind of riffing now. How being clean, being neat, brushing your teeth with whatever it takes, taking a piece of ice and cleaning yourself makes a difference. It's easier to keep somebody alive and to be their friend and to want them around when they look good. So do it. My mother would be all the time fixing it was not so easy. Like, great woman. I discover her now, but somebody always telling you how to dress better. It was not that easy. Very critical. I shouldn't say anything bad about my mother, but it's not bad. And sweaters, every time I got a gift, it was a sweater. I had so many sweaters. I had more sweaters than Bill Cosby did. Remember Bill Cosby had all those sweaters in the show? I have like sweaters because this is the book on Amazon. It's free. The Kindle edition is free today and tomorrow. It's not expensive when it's not free. It's $3.99. The ebook is, but anyway. So here's a QR code. You could click on it and get it. The cover design is by Drew, who is here today. My daughter's Sabella. So this is, we stopped recording? Because anyway, no, Drew designed, Drew Park, and I think he did a great job designing the cover. And this concludes the formal presentation of my talk.